Hello, my name is Jamie Kwan. I am Assistant Curator at the Venda Museum and organizer of the upcoming exhibition, Deconstructing Ideology, the Cultural Revolution and Beyond, which opens on November 13th. Thank you for joining us today for this program. I am so excited to introduce our speaker, Professor Frank Dikötter, who will be presenting The Cultural Revolution, A People's History, in anticipation of the opening of our new exhibition. Professor Dikötter is a historian of modern China and the author of a dozen books that have changed the way we look at the country's history, including Mao's Great Famine, winner of the BBC Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction in 2011. His work has been translated into 20 languages, and these works include The Tragedy of Liberation, A History of the Chinese Revolution, 1945 to 1957, which was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2014, and The Cultural Revolution, A People's History, 1962 to 1976, the final volume in his trilogy on the Mao era. He is chair professor at the University of Hong Kong and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Frank, welcome to the Venda, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for a very generous introduction, and of course for inviting me to be here at the Venda Museum and literally in the office of what is, I believe, the curator, surrounded by books and, of course, wonderful posters on the wall. Now, when it comes to the Cultural Revolution, I think there are a number of issues there, and one is a very straightforward one. What exactly was it? That's a very difficult thing to answer. And to be fair to readers, I think it's difficult to answer because so many historians have not really quite addressed the issue at all. And then I think there is another issue, and that is to do with how historically we should see the Cultural Revolution not as one era, but as a number of quite distinct periods. It's a common mistake, I think, again, one made by historians, to see it as a sort of uniform period. Now, of course, things change, but in the case of the Cultural Revolution, the changes are quite drastic. So I've got a little introduction to address what I believe Mao Zedong had in mind when it came to the Cultural Revolution. And then I will talk about four very distinct periods. I will start in 1962, 63, and take it up to 66. I call these the early years. The Cultural Revolution doesn't come out of nothing. These are the years when Chairman Mao lays the foundation for the Cultural Revolution. This is followed by what I call the Red Years. The Red Years, in a nutshell, is really Mao giving ordinary people the rights to attack pretty much any party member, all the way up to the higher echelons of the hierarchy. Something no party, whether it's fascist under Hitler or Mussolini, or whether it is Marxist under Stalin or Kim Il-sung, has ever allowed. So these red years are 66 to 68. This is followed by something very different. From 68 to 71, I call these the black years. Black is not good. The army moves in and punishes the very people Mao had asked to criticize party members. So ordinary people are now purged by the million. The grip of the military comes to an end in 71. This is the start of, I think, the most potentially interesting era, 71 until the death of Chairman Mao himself, 76. I call these the gray years. And gray is quite good after red, after black, after a lot of death, a lot of persecution, and there's purges. Gray years are good in the sense that people realize the party has lost a lot of its clout, it has damaged itself, and they tend to use the opportunity to just get on with their own lives. I'll talk about that quite briefly towards the end of my lecture. So here you have an outline of what I want to do. So let's go back to the introduction. What is it that Chairman Mao had in mind? And let me start with a very brief anecdote. This is the summer of 1963, and Chairman Mao receives a delegation of African guerrilla fighters. And in the audience, there is a young man, tall, square-shouldered, from southern Rhodesia. And he has a question for the chairman. He says, Chairman Mao, there used to be a red star shining bright over the Kremlin in Moscow. But that star has disappeared. The Soviet Union used to help us. Now they are selling weapons to our enemies. So my question to you is as follows. Will the red star above the Tiananmen Square in Beijing, above the Forbidden City, will that red star also vanish? Chairman Mao sits back, becomes pensive, puffs on a cigarette, and says, I understand your question. You are saying that the Soviet Union has betrayed the revolution. The Soviet Union has become, can I guarantee to you that our country, the People's Republic of China, will not betray the revolution as well. We're thinking very hard about this. That's the anecdote. Now, fast forward by about 3 years, on the 1st of June, 1966, an incendiary editorial is published in the People's Daily. The title is quite straight, Monsters and Demons. It is a call to ordinary people from all walks of life to somehow become vigilant and make sure that the enemies of the revolution are flushed away. Now, of course, a great many people are somewhat surprised by this. After all, since 1949, there's been one purge after another to make sure that there are no counter-revolutionaries who could possibly infiltrate the party, government, or the army. Nonetheless, every single one at this point in time knows, as a result of years of propaganda, that the number one representative of modern revisionism is Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader and party general secretary in the Soviet Union. This goes back to 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev, in a secret speech that very much shook the entire socialist camp to the core, denounced his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. I'm sure you will have heard of him. In a secret speech, Nikita Khrushchev denounces his many crimes and also the cult of personality. This is very much the start of de-Stalinization. Chairman Mao must have wondered how it could be possible that in the mighty Soviet Union, which managed to defeat Nazi Germany, one man could somehow single-handedly engineer a complete reversal of policy. That really was the question. But first of all, Khrushchev in 1956 denounces Stalin, starts de-Stalinization. Then 2 years later, he comes up with the notion of peaceful coexistence with the imperialist camp. Imperialist camp is really Japan, Europe, United States. Of course, a concept that rattled a great many of revolutionaries around the world, including that very young man from southern Rhodesia who had asked a question to the chairman in 1963. So then the question is, if Khrushchev could single-handedly engineer a reversal of policy, how could that be prevented? Now, I think this is what Chairman Mao had in mind. In 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution led by Lenin, the assets of people referred to as the capitalist class had been confiscated. But so-called capitalist culture was still allowed to circulate, resulting in the ability of a small number of people, including Nikita Khrushchev, to somehow pervert the entire machinery from above. So Chairman's answer to this problem was to say that a second revolution was required. There was a revolution to confiscate the assets of the capitalists in 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution in Moscow. Now what was required is a revolution against the very culture of the capitalist class. In other words, he called it the Cultural Revolution. Now, of course, behind these theories, there was something else going on, namely an old man who was very keen to consolidate his legacy, his standing in world history. Mao was keen to become the leader of the socialist camp. In other words, steal the thunder away from the Soviet Union. He had come to power under Stalin, who was the leader of the socialist camp, and he didn't have a great deal of respect for him. Mao, quite rightly, I think, believed that it was he, Mao, who had brought a quarter of humanity into the socialist camp, not Joseph Stalin. And again, after 1949, it was Mao who had managed to fight the United Nations to a standstill in the Korean War, not Joseph Stalin. Not to mention, of course, Nikita Khrushchev, who Mao viewed with great contempt. Now, the very first attempt by Mao Zedong to somehow take over from the take over the mantle of leadership of the socialist camp is in 1958, as you know, when there is a great leap forward, when people in the countryside are herded into giant collectives called people's communes. The idea was as follows: if these hundreds of millions of people in the countryside could become soldiers in a giant army to be deployed day and night, then China could catapult itself past the Soviet Union and become the leader of the socialist camp. Mao believed that he had very much discovered the golden bridge leading from socialism into a world of utopia, communism, making him the leader, spiritual and otherwise, of the worldwide communist revolution. Of course, it didn't quite go like that. As a result of the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 62, tens of millions of people were beaten, starved, neglected to death, an enormous catastrophe. So then the Cultural Revolution is really Mao's second attempt, again, to supersede the Soviet Union. Here is what he thinks. Lenin is a great man, having initiated and led the Bolshevik Revolution, but Khrushchev is the revisionist who has led the Soviet Union back onto the path towards capitalism. Now, he's the enemy. So what Mao will do now, much as Lenin came up with a great October socialist revolution, Mao will come up with a great proletarian cultural revolution, the second stage in the worldwide revolution, one which no longer takes us from capitalism to socialism, but from socialism into communism. In other words, Mao sees himself as the one who inherits, defends, and of course develops Marxism, Leninism into something new called Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. That really is, I believe, what he has in mind with the Cultural Revolution. Destroy the old culture to permanently establish a foundation for the workers of the world, so to speak. No revisionism, no backtracking there. Of course, this is not the only thing that is happening. Chairman Mao is keen to make sure that nobody can really undermine his legacy. He has seen what happened to Stalin. The moment he dies, or 3 years later, rather, Stalin dies in 53, 56, Khrushchev undermines everything he did. Could it happen to him? That's another question. So towards the end of his life, this is also a chairman who not only thinks in terms of hubris, his standing in history, but is also very much paranoid about a possible stab in the back, about others around him destroying his legacy, either as he is still alive or after his death. So the Cultural Revolution is also an attempt by Mao Zedong to make sure that no other leader could possibly undermine him and his legacy. In other words, Mao uses the Cultural Revolution to hem in all his potential and real enemies within the party. It's a sordid, vengeful affair in which he will have many of his colleagues persecuted by others. So in that sense, there's also a huge sort of purge of the party itself. You might say that vision of a communist future, a world without capitalist ideas, is quite theoretical, that sordid plotting against his real and imaginary enemies, something quite different. But of course, as far as Mao is concerned, it is one and the same thing. It is all to defend the revolution. And he himself is the revolution. He sees himself as the revolution. Now, who exactly would these real or imaginary enemies be? Well, I think I already alluded to it earlier on. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev initiates de-Stalinization by criticizing the cult of personality. In Beijing, Deng Xiaoping, Liu Shaoqi, two people very high up, and others, by the end of the year, delete Mao Zedong thought from the party constitution. Mao is seething with anger, but there's very little he can do. He's hemmed in both by Khrushchev and by his colleagues in Beijing. Worse is to come. In January 1962, some 7,000 leading members of the party gather in Beijing from all over the country to discuss the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. Lots of rumors circulate. Nobody would dare to ever criticize Mao to his face. But of course, rumors circulate about the chairman being slightly delusional, being innumerate, being dangerous. And a number of these officials who have seen literally millions of ordinary people die in their own province, some of them believe that it is Chairman Mao who is responsible for this enormous disaster. At this point, Mao's star is very much at its lowest. So he must be thinking, who among those 7,000 cadres in this conference is the future Khrushchev, the future Nikita Khrushchev, who will start a campaign of de-Maoification, and possibly even before he dies. That, I believe, is the background of the Cultural Revolution. Now, earlier on, I said that I would talk about 4 different eras. And I said that the very first period starts almost immediately after this 7,000 cadre conference in January 1962. By 1963, Mao initiates a campaign called the Socialist Education Campaign. It's a bit of a mouthful, but in a nutshell, after the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, the chairman and other people believe that people in the countryside and in the cities have to be educated again about the benefits of socialism, in the countryside in particular. From 1960 onwards, large parts of the countryside go back towards a traditional move away from collectivization. There's more traditional ways of trading in order to survive the famine. This is described as a revisionist attempt to go back onto the road towards capitalism. Now, number 2, not Chairman Mao, but Liu Shaoqi, who's number 2, becomes responsible for the socialist education campaign and is absolutely ruthless. He veers more towards the left than Mao Zedong himself. At one point, he announces that a third of the country is supposed to be in the hand of counter-revolutionaries. He initiates a purge that results in the punishment and occasional death of some 5 million party members. Entire leaderships of provinces are accused of having taken the capitalist road and are overthrown. Now, of course, Chairman Mao can see this from a distance and is worried that when the party leadership is overthrown in an entire province, Liu Shaoqi is replacing that leadership with his own man. But there's another concern. It's not just about purging, it's also about education, socialist education campaign, educating young people as to the revolution in primary schools, small children, in secondary schools, in universities. A martial atmosphere is cultivated by the army. Lin Biao, the man in charge of the army, comes up with the little red book, quotations from the chairman, that students read. At every level, young people are educated in class hatreds. They're told that they should be vigilant, on the watch out for potential revisionists, for counter-revolutionaries, for capitalist rollers. And this is all before 1966. These are the early years. Now, let me move on and go back to June the 1st, 1966, when this editorial entitled "Sweep Away All Monsters and Demons" is published by the People's Daily, when ordinary people are invited to very much protect what is called in the parlance of the time the dictatorship of the proletariat, and make sure that no dictatorship of the bourgeois class can emerge instead. This is very much the opening call of the Cultural Revolution and the start of what I referred to earlier on as the Red Years. Something else happens. That very same week, a poster circulates that appeared on the campus of the country's foremost university, Beijing University. The poster alleges that the leaders of that university are a bunch of Khrushchev-like revisionists. This is the beginning of a campaign by students across the country to start examining the backgrounds of their teachers. Of course, they have been talking about class enemies, they've been educated in class hatred, and they're itching to get their hands on a true counter-revolutionary. And occasionally they think they find them. They will beat up a teacher who somehow in the past criticized the Great Leap Forward. They will give a hard time to somebody on campus who has denied the benefits of communism. But a couple of these students go too far. This is still in June and July, the summer of 1966. Some of them go too far and actually take to task a number of leading party members. Deng Xiaoping, Liu Shaoqi, who I mentioned earlier on, have been put in charge of the Cultural Revolution by the chairman, who himself is traveling in the south of the country, watching what is happening in Beijing very carefully from a distance. And Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi send work teams to these universities to punish the students that somehow overstep the mark by criticizing leading party officials. Mao, in mid-July, returns to Beijing. Instead of supporting his two colleagues, he turns around and accuses them of suppressing the students and running a dictatorship. These are the terms he uses. He says, to rebel is justified. To rebel, 造反有理 in Chinese. To rebel is justified. In other words, he takes the side of the students and opposes his very own colleagues. While rebel students do, a number of them step forward. They wear military uniforms, they have the little red book, they vow to defend the chairman and carry out the Cultural Revolution. They declare war on the old world. These are the Red Guards. They start vandalizing cemeteries. They tear down temples. They damage churches. They burn books. They try to get rid of any and every sign of anything that smacks of a feudal, superstitious, capitalist, bourgeois world. In a nutshell, the old culture must disappear in order to be replaced with a new proletarian culture. Not only that, but many of the Red Guards also visit individual homes, 250,000 in Shanghai alone, taking away any artifact that smacks of the past. Books are burned on the one hand, but also rare bronzes or calligraphy goes up in flames. Not only that, but they attack ordinary people who are seen to be counter-revolutionaries or revisionists. Some of the teachers are beaten quite literally to death. One of them in Beijing is doused in petrol set alight. Others are electrocuted. On the outskirts of Beijing, several people are even buried alive. By September 66, this is Red August. By the end of September 66, in Beijing alone, 1,700 people have died as a result of the violence of the Red Guards. But there is a small problem here. When Chairman Mao said to rebel is justified, he hoped that the Red Guards would attack the higher echelons of power. He called it bombard the headquarters. Chairman was great when it came to slogan. Bombard the headquarters means you can take a task, not a local official. You can go all the way to a big ministry, take somebody task. But of course, a great many of the senior party members had honed their survival skills in decades of political infighting. And so they were not about to be outflanked by a bunch of inexperienced young Red Guards. What they did in many cases is deflect the violence away from themselves by encouraging the Red Guards to attack ordinary people denounced as counter-revolutionaries, capitalist rovers, you name it. Sometimes they even provided the names and addresses of these potential victims. Not only that, but in many cases, the leading officials set up their own Red Guards. In the parlance of the time, this was called to raise the red flag in order to fight the red flag. It's one of these formulas from the period. It means you pretend to go along with the Cultural Revolution, but in fact you are undermining it. So before you know it, there are factions fighting each other. Nobody's quite sure who the true targets of the Cultural Revolution are, and people are divided over where these reactionary counter-revolutionaries and revisionists are. So in parts of the country, party headquarters are being besieged by Red Guards. In other parts, leading officials surround themselves by party activists and manage to defend themselves. Now here we move on to the next stage. We're still in the Red years. This is all extraordinarily violent. Clearly the Red Guards cannot do the job. So in the autumn of 1966, Mao gives license to ordinary people to criticize any party member at any level of the hierarchy. This is unprecedented. You will not find anything like it in any one-party state. No one-party state, no dictator will allow ordinary people to take to task the very engine that has brought them to power, namely the party. Yet this is precisely what happens. But of course, it's a similar problem. There is an explosion here as every pent-up frustration caused by years of communist rule released. There's no lack of people who are upset, for instance, in the countryside, about seeing relatives being starved to death during the Great Leap Forward. There are plenty of workers in the cities who barely get by, living in miserable conditions, almost unable to feed their own families. And of course, they're all the victims of the previous purges, including of course, the socialist education campaign carried out by Liu Shaoqi before 1966. There's plenty of people who have grievances against the party. But the problem is, of course, that they too, like the Red Guards, become divided. They do not know where the true counter-revolutionaries are. They jostle for power. They start fighting each other. This country is going very rapidly towards civil war. In early 1967, the chairman steps in again. He asks the army to intervene and support what Chairman Mao refers to as the true proletarian left. But of course, the result was the same. The army itself is divided over who the true revisionists are. They themselves live in factions that will begin to fight each other. So before you know it, round about February, March, April, you see factions fight each other in the streets with the support from different factions in the army, with guns, occasionally with tanks, with anti-aircraft artillery, extraordinary levels of violence. And all of them are, of course, convinced that they are the true revolutionaries, carrying out the true wishes of Chairman Mao. Mao Zedong himself thrives in what can only be described as willed chaos, not just chaotic, but willed chaos. He can step in, he can rescue a very loyal follower, or contrariwise, he can just throw one of his close colleagues to the wolves, literally to be devoured by one of these factions. He relishes a game in which he can change the rules all the time. And of course, a mere word from him will determine the lives of countless people. It is sufficient for him to declare this or that faction in this or that province to be either revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. And his verdict can change in no time, feeding an endless cycle of violence as people fight to prove their loyalty to the chairman and the Cultural Revolution. These are the Red Years. They come to an end in 1968, summer. After 2 extraordinary years, the army steps in. New Revolutionary Party committees are established across the country, and they pretty much place power in the hands of military officers, meaning that the army is in effect in charge. This is very much the beginning of what I call the Black Years, and they couldn't be more different from the Red Years. The Red Years is really a chairman giving ordinary people a great deal of power, and now there's a chairman giving the army a great deal of power to punish the very people who spoke out against the party during the Red Years from 1966 to 68. Soldiers fan out, control pretty much every factory, every school, every office. They turn this country into a garrison state. One of their first acts is to send millions of students and other ordinary people to the countryside to be re-educated by the peasants, quote unquote. In many cases, a great many of these students live without any abode in abandoned temples, in pigsties, in sheds, in caves. A lot of them are far away from home without any form of protection. Great levels of violence by local village cadres against these people who are supposed to be in a process of re-education by the peasants. In a province like Hubei, thousands of young girls, some as young as 14, raped, far away from home, no protection. A great many barely get by food-wise. But then, this is not the only thing that the military do. They then turn, once they have purged the cities, of all those who took the chairman to his word and actually became Red Guards, or actually did criticize the party, or did take to task the party official. Once this has been purged by all of these, special committees are set up by the army to examine the alleged enemy links of party members and ordinary people alike. At this particular point, the talk is no longer about capitalist roaders or revisionists or counter-revolutionaries. It's all about spies, traitors, renegades, anyone with an enemy, with a foreign link in their past is seen as a potential enemy. If you knew somebody before 1949 who came from the West, if you had a Japanese friend, if you any link with the West, with foreign country, is seen as potential evidence of being a spy. In Shanghai alone, 170,000 people are harassed by the army. Some 5,400 are hounded to their deaths or executed or otherwise terminated, so to speak. In a province like Guangdong, just across the border from Hong Kong, where I live and work, one estimate puts the death toll at 40,000. And again, not quite the end of it. This is followed by a campaign against corruption, quote unquote. The endless campaigns against corruption, of course, because everybody in a one-party state is corrupt. But this one also targets ordinary people yet again. This is the point where a simple utterance, a simple gesture can potentially be seen as criminal. If you inadvertently poke a hole in a poster of Chairman Mao, if you inadvertently criticize the planned economy, then you are potentially an enemy of the state. There are places, entire provinces, where 1 in 50 people is implicated in this campaign. In other words, the population is crushed during these black years from 68 to 71. Now, I said earlier on that Lin Biao, in charge of the army, was the one who very much helped promote the Cultural Revolution before 1966 by distributing and printing the Little Red Book, by fostering a martial atmosphere. Mao counted on Lin Biao to very much launch the Cultural Revolution and sustain it. But now that the army is in charge, Lin Biao also uses the turmoil to place his own people in key positions in the army across the country. Now, you don't have to be a dictator to smell a rat. Clearly, Chairman Mao is worried about the grip that the army has acquired since the summer of 1968. In September 71, Lin Biao dies in a mysterious plane crash. He is instantly denounced by the party. And of course, now is the turn for the army to be purged. This is the end of the Black Years. The soldiers go back to the barracks. The grip that the army had on civilian life is loosened. This is the end of the Black Years. In the countryside, in particular, hundreds of millions of villagers had watched family members starve to death during the Great Leap Forward. So they lost their faith in the Communist Party during that period. But now with the Cultural Revolution, people in the countryside realize that it is not just the reputation of the party that has been damaged, but its very organization. You got to remember what I said earlier on. A great deal in the Cultural Revolution is about punishing party members who are seen as real or potential enemies of the chairman. So the party comes out of it very much enfeebled. There is not a party official who is left standing. All of them have been taken to task at one point or another. So they too are actually fed up. After 3 decades, 1949, all the way till 71, the 3 decades of entrenched violence and endless campaigns and an utterly dysfunctional collectivized economy in the countryside, people have had enough. And they start something I call a silent revolution. They do not oppose the party, but very quietly, on the sly, they start taking back their own tools from the collectives. They start claiming the land and cultivating it in a way that they see fit rather than obey orders from above. In brief, they start taking back very basic economic freedoms. They reconnect with past practices. Take one example in Yan'an, which is sort of a hallowed ground of the revolution. It's the place in Shanxi province where Mao Zedong and his guerrilla fighters went during the Second World War. A team of inspectors is dispatched to inspect Yan'an in 1974. What they discover takes them aback. There isn't a party member who attends or pays attention to any one of the directives that come from Beijing. There are posters with Lin Biao still fluttering in the wind, although this man has been denounced since his death in September 1971. Not only that, but what they discover is a thriving black market. The farmers, with the consent of the local party officials, actually have abandoned all attempt to grow grain as they are supposed to do for the party. Instead, what they do is grow pigs, sell the meat on the black market, are not allowed to sell meat. It must go straight to the state. This is a collectivized economy. They sell the meat on the black market and use the money to buy grain from the black market in order to fulfill the procurement quotas to the state. Everybody connives in this business. And it isn't just Yan'an. In other parts of Shanxi province, and in fact, across the country, local cadres hand back the land to the villagers. They allow them to cultivate it. Or the farmers themselves take it back, and there's very little that local cadres can do about it. The farmers start making all the key decisions about what should be planted on their own plot and what should be done with the produce. Occasionally, they keep back the produce from the state and use it to set up their own factories. They open black markets. Not just that, but they also operate underground factories. Here is another example, far away from Shanxi province in Yan'an, just outside Shanghai, that used to be a very thriving port before 1949, in a place called Chuansha, where the soil is very sandy. The farmers abandon any attempt to grow cotton, which they must do according to the local party dictates. Instead, they start operating underground factories to the extent that even before Chairman Mao dies in 1976, some 74% of all growth comes directly from these underground factories. Quite astonishing. Across the country, a large number of people very quietly undermine the people's communes from below. In Zhejiang province, along the coast, some parts of that province, up to 2/3 of the villagers just walk out of the people's communes and work on their own. They are go-it-aloners, quote unquote, in the parlance of the time. 1976, the chairman passes away, but this silent revolution that I mentioned is unstoppable. Deng Xiaoping, who is sometimes portrayed as the architect of modern reform, proclaims that the collectivized economy is the backbone of the countryside. In 1979, in 80, in 81, time and again, he proclaims the need for farmers, villagers to return to the people's communes. Well, it has very little effect. By 1982, ordinary people in the countryside have literally hollowed out these people's communes, which collapse altogether. The collectivized economy in the countryside is over, and it is thanks to the actions of hundreds of millions of ordinary people who've had enough. They've also had enough of the entire Marxist ideology. They no longer believe it. And of course, in the cities too, people have lost any illusion they might have had about Marxism, communism, and a future utopia. But something happens. As much as in the countryside and in the cities, people want to have political freedoms. The party under Deng Xiaoping is determined to crush them. Party members have seen what happens when you allow ordinary people to criticize party members. This is exactly what happened during the Red Years under Chairman Mao in the autumn of 1966. People expressed great discontent with the one-party state. So in effect, what you have after the death of Mao is a communist party that lives in fear of its own people. On the one hand, the party will allow people to get on with very basic economic freedoms, yet on the other hand, their political aspirations are ruthlessly suppressed. It is Deng Xiaoping himself who gives the order to 100,000 soldiers and 200 tanks to converge onto the heart of the capital Beijing in June 1989 to crush the democracy movement. The massacre that results is, of course, a display of steely determination on the part of the Communist Party, but also sends a message that pulsates all the way till today. And that message is, do not query the monopoly over power of the Communist Party. Thank you for listening.
Wow. Frank, thank you so much for joining us and for that fascinating talk about the Cultural Revolution. It is such a complex period of history, but you made it so fascinating, so interesting and digestible, and really made us understand how it's still relevant today. So I hope for all of you listening that this provided some historical context for our upcoming exhibition, which I hope you'll visit, Deconstructing Ideology, the Cultural Revolution and Beyond, which opens very soon on the 13th. And please check out our upcoming programs and events happening at the museum at www.vendamuseum.org. Thank you again for tuning in, and thank you again, Frank, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.